all. All right. Hey everybody, I'm so glad you're all here for Julie's big day. I have her bio here, but I want you to know that we all know. She graduated with us, she grew up with us, and her claim to fame is that she's 364 days younger than me. And her mother called me every day on my birthday. Aww. Every day. So it's a big deal to me, and I'm so glad Julie's here. So I'm going to read the official, because we all know her unofficially. And so Julie is an author of the story collection Two Deserts. I say it every time. It's just released. So it's hot off the press here by Hopewell Publications, and the novel What Birds Can Only Whisper was published by Turnstone Press. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the North American Review, the Louisville Review, the Barcelona Review, the International Journal of Women's Studies. I've only been in MLS, and she says all these good things. She has, Julie teaches fiction on the faculty of the Brief Residency Master of Fine Arts in the writing program of Spalding University in Louisville, Kentucky. Her honors include grants from the Canada Council, a Pushcart Prize nomination, and a writer-in-residence position at Burton House in the gold rush city of Dawson City, Yukon. She has been a guest editor in fiction and creative nonfiction for the Louisville Review and reviewed books for the Sunday book section of the San Diego Union Tribune for nearly 10 years. With her mother, Molly Rogers Brickman, who we all know was a principal, and she scared the out of me. She ran a writers group for residents of a senior care facility. Julie holds an MFA in writing from Vermont College and a PhD in psychology from the University of Manitoba. A New Jersey girl, forget that, a Metuchen girl from the historic Brainy Borough. She now lives in Laguna Beach, California, is currently experimenting with trying to work on 2 new novels. Early praise for her new book, Two Deserts. This is a brilliant work, bold, true-hearted, and beautiful. Brickman believes in the reality of the body, but the body illuminated by an unflinching intellect and indomitable spirit. And I give you Julie Brickman. Thank you. And this is not a commercial, but we have these, so you can order the books.
Yes.
So this is a commercial. It is a commercial.
Which I will continue.
Okay, continue with the commercial.
Thank you, everyone. This is just an amazing crowd for me. I'm going to try not to cry, but I am so moved and happy. This is actually my first launch. Two Deserts was officially released on October 1st. So this is my big launch. And I couldn't be happier than to have it here. Here we have, and Dottie will distribute these. We've had a little glitch in getting the books actually into the bookstore on time. As a consequence, what we have here is a form to order them from the publisher, who has promised that he will not only send the book, but if you want it signed, he will send the postage for you to send it to me. I will sign it and send it back to you. So you know, pick up a form on your way out. Dottie will help distribute. Chris will help distribute. I'm sure they have them up on,
yes, we have more here.
Anyway, so I also want to thank Sergio and Karen very much, who have owned and started a new bookstore in this wonderful town that we all love, but also because starting a bookstore in this era where you have to compete with everything online is just a fabulous thing to do and needs all our support. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for having me. As I said, I just am so glad to see you here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. I am going to then, hi Jimmy, welcome.
Jim.
And I'm going to read a little bit. Probably I'll read for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes maybe, depending on how long my excerpts take. and then take questions if we have time and energy for that. So, two deserts. The cover design is sort of a way of illustrating the deserts that the book addresses. There are deserts of place, and in this book, most of the stories in the desert of hi.
I'll sit right up here.
I'm delighted you made it. Right?
We're glad we made it, despite all this stuff.
But you got here.
It's going to be a love fest.
So we have here most of the stories that are set in the deserts of place, the sand desert, are set in the Middle East. That is in the Rub al-Khali, which is the desert in the Arabian Gulf Peninsula. It is the largest sand desert in the world. It's larger than the state of France. It is also quite a wild desert, and it has, as one might guess, given where it is, the world's largest oil field. The other desert in the book is the deserts of the heart. That, for me, grew out of the long years in which my husband was ill. And I wanted to write about what it meant to live in that desert. And like all writers, of course, we cobble together either from places we dream about in one way or another, or from places we know about. But all fiction, even though at times you can feel the place that it starts. Most of us by now in our lives have known the deserts of the heart. So, an interesting thing that happened to me was that after the book was out, the title was out, the cover was done, I went to a party in celebration of a friend of mine, and someone read from this wonderful poem that was written in memory of Yeats by Auden, right after W.B. Yeats died. In the last stanza, there are the lines I wish I had chosen for an epigraph, which are, "In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountains start." Such a hopeful couple of lines. So there are, interestingly enough, there's some other settings in this book that are also deserts of place. Although everyone knows Southern California is a desert, and there are many stories set there. What people often don't know is that the Yukon Territory, just just east of Alaska, and north of British Columbia, is also a desert, as defined by Brickman. And there is, the final story is actually set there. So, I want to introduce you a little bit to the two different stories. I'll start with the desert of place from the story called The Night at the Souk. Within weeks, let me first get back up a little bit. The story's about, and a number of the stories that are spined in this are about a travel agent, an American travel agent who goes into business in the Arabian Gulf, a country called Arabia, which is actually a fictional version of the United Arab Emirates, and goes into business with someone that she used to work with in New York to help him in his massive American Express-like Middle Eastern travel agency and conglomerate, where the only business he hasn't been able to get has been really the Western tourism business. So she's arrived in this country called Arabia and is trying to, she's got a good position, it's a great job, she's trying to find her way. The night at the souk. Within weeks, I realized it was impossible to get around in this culture in Western garb, so I decided to take myself to the traditional souk and wander, maybe try on the local clothes, an abaya, a headscarf, and a mask. It seemed simple, really. Wearing an abaya, I could explore this swath-veiled country. I could discover ways through the maze of customs, innovate cutting-edge tours to gratify our cutting-edge customers. Maybe I can even make the love you, hate your homeland romance work with Samir. So she decides she'll go. I flagged a cab with an Arabic rooftop sign. Local taxis were meterless, so I leaned into the front window to establish a price. The scarlet fez on the driver announced him as an immigrant Muslim, part of a huge labor force imported to do menial jobs, probably from Pakistan or some squalid, disease-ridden village in Africa where a family of 10 lived on his earnings. The dingy eyes below the fez jiggled with furious energy, twin maelstroms in a narrow, suffering face. Why bother to haggle, I thought to myself. If I saw his family, I'd probably give them my money. He shrugged off my butchered Arabic and signaled with a double flash of crooked fingers, 20 dirhams. Suddenly, way too high for the short distances within the city limits. Suddenly I was into it. I splayed a hand and axed it with the other one half the price. The speed of his agreement meant the ride would have cost an Arab 5 dirhams tops. So they get to the souk. As twilight dwindled, the souk flared into a dazzling yellow incandescence. A brilliant desert light poured onto the wares like celestial polish, making them glow and sparkle with uncanny appeal. There was an overwhelming amount to see. Rows of shops clustered like teeth along the crooks of alleyways, each a jumble of wares: luggage, t-shirts, dishes, pots, cameras, perfumes, handbags, sandals, electronics, gold, jewels. You never knew what would be displayed with what. I moseyed through the crystalline light, along streets narrow as trails, and stared at the wares and stalls, tents, vendor carts, shop windows, cataloging what I wanted to buy: a couched camel of cured hide, a set of finger rings yoked by spidery gold strands, to linked bracelets, and a Aladdin-shaped oil lamp. Noise and vitality riffled the air, along with racy scents and that crazy amber light. Whiffs of spicy perfumes and incenses, mingled with oils crackling from rotating spits of shawarma. Nutty, honeyed aromas floated from cafes and bakery shops. Black-shrouded women hunched over counters and balance scales in gold shops as they haggled for jewelry, the asset they could always claim as own. Then there's a part I'll skip, which is a flashback. She goes back to her arrival in the country. She's flown over, and in the plane were these 3 co-wives who were just garbed in these fantastically colorful dresses and chattering and laughing away. But when she gets to the baggage claim, they're dressed in black, they're completely mute, and they're standing behind their husband. And suddenly she chokes on her Arabic that she's fluent in and thinks to herself, I'm not sure I want to share this language. So she's struggling to get her Arabic back. Now she's in the market and she spots a rack of shaylas outside a market stall, swung seductively in the jeweled light. Abayas hung along the interior wall like paintings in a gallery. Abayas had always struck me as too holy for public commerce, black robes of Islamic modesty, to be sold only in homes, and then only with the blessing of an imam like halal meat. It seemed sacrilegious to find them flaunted in the open souk, like seeing the vestments of the clergy on display in a department store. I glanced behind me. Women promenaded around as if they were free, yet hijab erased any sign of individuality. I couldn't see the expression on their faces or judge the attitude in their bearings. I couldn't tell if they were young or old, flabby or toned, happy or sad. They were erased, blotted out, no bodies. I itched to tear open each abaya and see who lived inside. Their blackness affected my perception, afflicted me with cultural blindness. I felt obsessed by a desire to establish some connection with them, exchange a look, a moment, understand something of their lives from the inside. I needed to be able to talk about women's lives here, every Westerner would ask. Only women knew the secrets they lived by in this veiled land. Only women could decode them for me, make it possible with smear. I stole up to the display of abayas and shaylas, one thought in my mind: I could see what it's like. The shopkeeper spotted me fingering the cloth. Ah! The texture in my hands felt like thin wool. Come in, he invited, his undertone insistent. It felt urgent to touch each headstone, trace the scallops around their edges, examined the beadwork. Some were not completely black, but rimmed by mosaic-like designs of metallic pinks and roses, indigos and emeralds and peacock blues, or silver and gold leaf embroidery. Maybe I couldn't judge the implications of each weave and design, but I could find something. Try? The shopkeeper swept his hands over his head in a draping motion. It couldn't hurt. I crossed the threshold into the tiny shop. A breeze as mild as puppy breath rustled through the dangling black shapes, making them sway like opera gowns. The perfumed silks emitted a sweet, musty scent. The proprietor gave off a faint odor of olive oil and sweat. He was a big turbaned man, stooped but with quick, skilled movements. Try, he urged. His guttural R sounded deep and full-throated. He slipped an abaya from its hanger. The silk glistened like water in moonlight. Quaker gray pearls pebbled the stylish tucks along the shoulder. "You're a Muslim?" he said. I buttoned the abaya right up to the neck. It fell into elegant Greek folds. I twirled in front of the mirror, pleased with the look, as though by draping my form in black I had become enigmatic, ethereal. The shopkeeper waited for the answer to his question. Two local men, first squat as a stump, the second fragile as a comma, marched into the store and began a voluble exchange. Pinned by the hot yellow light and the wax and wane of their stares, I felt sure their banter was about me and grew awkward. The proprietor barked a call into the street. An assistant, who looked about 14, incarnated like a phantom. The boy arranged a selection of merchandise folded into cellophane bags in front of the stocky customers. Abayas, the tripa is selecting clothes for his wife. He jabbed his finger at one with such confidence in the ascendancy of his own taste. A jolt of insight rocked through me. How many wives had it taken to acquire that kind of assurance? He thrust the parcel into his cohort's hands while he drew out his billfold. The proprietor plucked down a triangular headscarf and flapped it in front of my face. The plush fabric looked like a luxuriant version of the abaya's whispering silk. I placed it gingerly on my hair, wrapped it around my chin, and tossed the ends over my shoulders as I'd watched the local women do. My blonde hair vanished like a plane in a storm. Only the face was Western now. The shoppers gaped. I thought about what Miriam had said. "You should leave now, Emma. You are not welcome here." And Aisha, "You don't want those terrorist boys to catch you playing Muslim." And Samir, "Politics here is a dangerous business." "American?" the stocky man asked. I knew I shouldn't answer. You never know who you're talking to. All four men seemed transfixed by the interchange. I gave a nod, Samir-like in its brevity. So there's about 5 or 6 stories set in the Middle East. And then there are stories set in the other desert. And I'd like to jump around in one of them. The first one of the stories set in the other desert, called The Cop, the Hooker, and the Ride-Along. Some of you, some California people, may even find the setting familiar. At 7 a.m. Sunday morning, a police cruiser settles in front of our house. CIU is painted on the side in large blue letters, and black vertical bars rib the back windows. I can make out the silhouette of a portly officer in the driver's seat, his neck swiveled to watch a house across the street. My husband and I live on a quiet residential street near the summit of a hill, far from the center of town. Broad and spacious in one direction, our road is cramped in the other, a harrowing drive around elbow turns where a micro moment of inattention could afflict or derange an existence. The back side of our house looks out on a canyon. We can stand at the window and gaze down at soaring birds, red-tailed hawks, crows, mockingbirds. In the distance, on a clear day, we can see the Pacific Ocean, the teal color in yesterday's sun. This is the second time I've seen the police cruiser parked here. Last time, they investigated the neighbor kitty corner across the street, Fred Wilson. Tall and thin and silver-haired, Fred's a friendly man, always tinkering in his garage late into the night. The fluorescent lights glowing into the black pitch of the air. He and his wife used to spend summers back east, though I've never seen his wife. Because I saw a large woman go into the house one day last month, I imagined Fred's wife as obese, though in a cozy way, softy, like an aunt from the old country, who was comfortable in a fat, chubby body, not possible here in California, where fat is an indignity and aging rude. Out back, a couple of deer are grazing on the brush, which almost makes me forget the sadness. At night, I roll pictures through my mind of all the beautiful sights and colors of each day. The deer, their tawny necks bent to feed, raise them still as steel, so I can see the flare of their moist black noses, arched and velvety at the end of tapered snouts, their ears cocked to gather vibrations, silent to me, and the round swell of their eyes looks startled and soft, sorrowful, I think. Some nights there are no pictures. CIU stands for Criminal Investigation Unit, I discover when I go out for the newspaper. On impulse, I walk over to the cruiser. A bloated, sweaty officer is taking notes on the computer screen mounted on the dash. Would you like a cup of coffee? Awkward, I forget to say, in a little to-go cup out here. No, ma'am, he says, twisting his sloping bulk to shield the screen from what he assumes are sneaking eyes. Years ago, when I was still a psychologist, I used to work with police, teach them things they didn't want to know about stress and human emotions. I rode in the patrol cars with them to find out what it was like. Come on welfare night, they'd snigger. And night welfare checks were distributed with showtime on the streets. First night I went out, a big burly cop tapped me for his car. Unusual. Police don't like to have strangers in their cars, especially social science types, muddled by theory and too soft in the heart. But Max's partner was down with the flu, which later became pneumonia, and he wanted someone to work the radio in case of an emergency. In the seedy part of town, where vagrants and drunks staggered through the streets and flop houses abounded, Max drove me through hooker territory. They each have their own corner, he explained, and they don't mooch on each other's turf. Beside the Italian pool hall and cappuccino bar, where I sometimes hung out by day, he pulled up next to a woman shivering in a white fur jacket and stiletto boots. New meat on the street? She leaned into the car, nodded. Well, don't go a block from here, you could get yourself hurt. She wouldn't, thanks. There are some real nasty pimps hang out down there. Stay away from them. He looked her up and down real slow. You look like a nice girl. What do you do by day? I'm a nurse, she acknowledged, with an embarrassed laugh. But I have a child, a daughter. You just can't get by on what nurses make. He nodded, serious-like. Times are tough. You protected? My mom was a hooker. She taught me the ropes. Well, good luck to you, sweet pea. And if you get in trouble, don't be afraid to call. Cops you see out here, they're after the Johns. We got a new program going. Ask for me. Max, you got that? Max, she said. I'm Jean. And she spelled Jean. So, the story goes back and forth between 3 or 4 storylines. One of them follows the illness storyline. One of them follows the cop and hooker storyline, the ride-along storyline. So I'll read you a little bit from each. I can hear my husband creep around the house, his hands squealing on the 2 banisters we've installed, as he steers himself down the stairs. It's been almost 3 years since the first symptom of his disease appeared. An inability to run on the mini trampoline. 6 months after that, he said, there's something weird going on. It was early in the morning on a Sunday like this one. I was lolling in bed, luxuriating in the topaz light jeweling the canyon, in the sight of him as lissom as a mountain lion he always looked for when we hiked. Now there was a bewildered look in his pond blue eyes. My left leg won't do what my brain tells it. Outside, the sea is gray today, the sky is pale. The fishing boat is gone. In its place, the triangular white sail of a yacht bobbing cheerfully on the small waves. Every night at dusk, a fishing boat chugs across the cove, and as the sun falls, a luminous spotlight shines from its side, as if a full moon has dropped right onto the deck to beam a path across the sea. A giant omniscient eye of light glows across the water and dispenses safety. that dark, dark harbor. In bed, I hold fast to that image of a beacon in the dark. Let the roll of the dreamy sea soothe me until I drop at last into the tomb of sleep. Every time we rode together, Max took me to see Jean. Always she was standing there on the corner beside the coffee bar and pool hall, tall and shivering in her fox fur, her hair piled in a brazen display of loops and curls, totemic in stature and pizzazz. Her skirts were short, her boots tall, and whenever she spotted us, she strode over to the car. "How's it going?" "Got my girl in the Fraser," she said, shy, proud, like a runaway who made it through her first day back at school. My girl in the Fraser. Max let out a hoot so prolonged it turned into a howl. "I'd better put my old lady on the streets," he joshed. "You're doing well, girl. Watch your back." "Fraser," he groused when we pulled away. "The fucking Fraser." He was happy for her all the same. The police cruiser is parked in front of our house again. It is late in the evening. Vestiges of salmon-colored twilight smear the charcoaling summer sky. The men in the cruiser dally for a while, conferring, I assume, though it takes a while. Once, when Max and I went to answer a domestic, he pounded on the door, then leapt aside, shouting, "Police, open up!" When I didn't follow suit, he grabbed my arm and yanked me over beside him. "It's a domestic," he hissed. "You never stand in front of the door in case they answer with a gun." The two cops ply open the front gate of my neighbor's house and bound to Fred's front door, where they scatter one to each side. Fred's house is obscured by layers of fence and garden. Darkness consumes the threshold, and the two officers in the wash of yellow light are quickly swallowed behind the thick closed door. The cantaloupe streaks in the sky have dimmed, and faraway streetlights are visible in the cold of night. I can see headlights moving along the coast highway, but unlike the lantern eye in the harbor, they don't look friendly. They look lost and unsteady, weaving down a road far from home, popping in and out of view. Cold has descended with the dark, and a shivery feeling races across my skin, reminding me of the day Jean called my office. "I have to see you," she announced, "right away." It took a while to figure out who was calling, and when I did, I said to come right over. "Tonight," she said, "before my shift." She meant street, not nursing shift. She meant after her daughter had been tucked safely into her expensive bed, and an elderly babysitter had been installed. But before she hit the streets. I was used to this kind of call. I got a lot of referrals from police, sexual assault centers, agencies that took in street kids. For reasons I could never identify, I'd gotten a reputation that I could be trusted. I think it was simply because I didn't equate bad luck or bad judgment with bad character, didn't confuse the result with the cause. Back then, to understand women's lives was radical. It gave me a reputation for being a tough babe, a feminist, when to be feminist meant something strong and edgy. Plus, I let people lie. I understood that the truth was too diminishing to bear except in glimpses, that they needed to make fictions from their experience just to get to sleep at night and back up in the morning. Storying, they called it, when they invented dreams about circumstances other than their own. Once they'd harvested enough resources to put the truth, ugly in spite of all the artistic claims about it, in a landscape fast enough to make it small, they would tell it. Truth had to be cut down to size, or it would assault you again. Jean came in at 9:30, a half hour later than we'd agreed. She was wearing jeans, tattered at the knee, and a ripped black t-shirt. Her dusty hair was clipped short around her face, which made me realize the heap of black curls was a wig. Her buttocks barely grazed the rim of the chair, and she hunched forward, so her weight rested mainly on her tense legs. Undecided she was, in spite of the urgency of her call. The chairs in my office were soft brown leather, armchairs vaguely Scandinavian in design. A marble side table shaped like a half moon rested flush against the wall. The tiny lamp on top emitted low light. I kept the therapy chairs angled toward the windows, so my visitors could look out or at me, as they chose. Jean opted to seize my attention with her eyes before she started. "I'm really fine," she said. "I don't know why I called you." It's always hard to figure that out. "Really? Other people don't know?" If they do, they're usually making something up. Lying. She made the word sound casual and musical, though her torso tensed. Motivating themselves, giving themselves a reason to get here. She sat back a little. I can make $100,000, she said, for a few hours of mega work, maybe 10 grand an hour. Oh, bet that's more than you make. I laughed. For sure I don't make that in an hour. In a month? Nope, not in a year. She snuggled back in her chair. She had something I didn't, and it made being here bearable. Relaxed, she began to cry. At first it was just moisture running from her eyes and her open mouth, but then it seemed to gather steam, because it escalated into a gasping wail, and all her body went into participating. Her heaving shoulders and abdomen, her jiggling, shaking, anxious legs. It was not the kind of sob that needed Kleenex. The act of handing her a tissue would inhibit the flow. So I sat and looked out the window, trying to give her the quiet acceptance I knew she needed. The night was tar dark, and a watery light fell from the street lamp, making everything in its corona look blurry. I realized then that it was raining, a daily event in this northwestern city of tall boreal trees and profuse flora. It had been misty all day, the sky leaking a dampness that clung to the skin in a clammy film. But now a light rain slanted outside the window, one of those spacious rains in which every drop glides slowly along its own trajectory, mirroring for brief seconds the entire world on tiny rotating cylinders, reflecting birch bark and spruce poles and pine needles, the bright light of a window, the bowing fronds of a willow, the glint of a lost trinket, all of which seemed to be sliding and falling, as though the raindrops were motionless and the world topsy-turvy. And suddenly I saw the two of us, Jean and me, in brown leather chairs, toppling and somersaulting, the lamp and the half moon of the marble table tumbling with us, all strangely stuck in precise arrangement to each other while we rotated and swirled. And I turned back to Jean, whose sobs were subsiding. She looked up at me as though she were saying words, so I nodded. Her eyes closed again, and when she opened her arms, she gave her head a shake, stretched her arms in front of her, and said, "Can't believe I fell asleep like that. How much time do we have?" "Enough," I said, though we were running over. First sessions often flitted around the fiery center of a problem. I reeled my mind backwards, through the rain, to retrieve what she'd been saying, before she started to cry, and I realized it was money, the 100 grand. I was 12, she said, when my mom first introduced me to the life. So that will give you a little bit of a taste of the two different story clusters in this book. And after this, what I had hoped is that some of you might have some questions that I could answer on this glorious day when we're all together again.
I'll go, Julie. Some of it came out of your experiences with your husband.
Some of it did,
And
as a start.
did it help the grief?
Most of them were written while he was ill. So one of the things that happened, for those of you who don't know, my husband was ill with ALS for 7 years. And during that time, it became hard for me to write long because there was so much caregiving and management that I had to do. So one of the things that came out of it was writing stories, which is not something I had done a lot of before. And I don't think it actually did help with the grief, but what it helped with was the loneliness. What happens, as many of you know who have been around illness, is you remember Susan Sontag wrote that there are two different kingdoms, the kingdom of the ill and the kingdom of the well. And what happened when my husband got sick was I crossed over with him into the kingdom of the ill. And all my well friends were like living in another world. And that's what this helped with. I felt connected again. I felt like I could put my world on the page. And of course, like most fiction writers, it's partly my world and a bridge, and there's other things that are included. That's of course what fiction allows us to do. Thank you, that's a good question. And I know it's a world you know as well. I think probably everyone can do. You had a question, Judy.
I wondered if you had that support group that was in the story when the main character led, if she really had a support group of women
You
who
know-
were in the same boat and could laugh and cry. And
Well, not those women, and although those women are cobbled together from women who tried to start a support group but didn't ultimately do one, partly because when you're in the world of illness, a lot of what you want to do is be out of it, and so whatever little bits of free time you can carve out, you probably don't want to spend with other people who are also needing to talk about the world of illness there. So the answer was, I never really stayed in any support group, although there were many were available. You know, people with ALS, which they call pals. There were these women that you'll see, although who they are in the story isn't quite who they were in person. They are like, again, with the fictional characters, you know, you start somewhere, but then you start pulling in other things that they remind you of. It ends up being an amalgamation of people that you've known and places that you've known, and so we get to call it fiction. And we get to play in our imagination, and that part, to get to that part was fun, the playing, what I was doing. So, yes and no is the answer to that question. Sheila.
In what way did your writing change after he died?
Well, that's a good question. I'm still, that's a very good question. I don't know if you heard, she asked, in what way did my writing change after my husband died? I feel like I'm still coming to terms with that. I was halfway through one of the two novels. I was halfway through a novel that's actually started out of that story, which is called The Dying Husband's Dinner Club. And I wanted to go back to it, but now the whole way I want to write it is different. So it won't be based on those four women, and in fact a new character has sprung out who seems to be a core character. So it's really on a close friendship between two women. It has much more redeeming parts to it than the initial one sounded like it would. And some of what happened is it became, I mean, there's a period of time after which I couldn't write. I remember when I lost my brother and I was taking singing lessons and I couldn't sing. And the teacher said this happens all the time in grief. We just can't do it anymore. I didn't think it would happen with writing. I've been writing for so long. But it's been hard for a while. And I'm just, fortunately I had this coming out and I had to pay attention to this. But a lot of what I did was was kind of restrike the novel. And how is the question I'm living with. I'm not sure I can answer it yet, because it's only 18 months. It seems like it's much longer, but it's only 18 months. So I'm still working that one out. I suspect what's going to happen is, what I've seen so far is that I seem to go deeper into character. I seem to actually have an increased empathy. Which reminds me, for those New York Times readers in the audience, and no, this is not too intellectual, I don't think. All of us readers in the audience, turns out that people who read literary fiction actually test as having more empathy than people who read any other kind of fiction. So it actually has a discernible effect on tests.
Or nonfiction.
Or
The article
nonfiction,
said
as compared to mainstream genre or nonfiction. Literary fiction readers go up on the empathy scale. Yes.
I just read that article, and how can you tell it's just because of people who have a lot of empathy are interested in reading?
Well, except that they have control groups. It's in the experimental method. So they don't, they didn't necessarily say, I'm looking at people who are already literary readers. They took people, they gave them literary and non-literary things to read. So the sample was random, which means it would not necessarily, it means it should be a cross-section of everything. So that's, in theory, what social science does.
It was very nice to meet that for English teachers, certainly.
I think it's an excellent study. It's the first time I've seen that. Though I do know, I personally think, my personal opinion is, much as I love her, that the writers that I love the best do have a big empathy quotient themselves. So, and it may, it could be shown in a sentence. It doesn't have to be this whole prolonged passage, but it's there. It's just there and you can feel it. And,
Can you just talk a little bit how your travels influence the writing in this book?
well, there are I love different places, and one of the things as a writer about place, it's a very good question, is that you can write far away from your own life. And you have this fascination with place, which shows in a few of these stories, both in the Middle East where I went, and in the Yukon story where I also lived for 3 months. And what I find is there's something easier about putting your emotional truth in a totally fictional world than sometimes it is when you write too close to home. And I also, again, I tend to write about things I love, and since I love to travel and see different places and learn from different cultures, or different regions of the country, I like to say, work there. It makes me able to learn more. Did you have any thoughts about that yourself? About traveling and how it is for you? Or reading about travel, either one.
I just find it more fascinating with how far you've gone than the safe places that I've gone.
I took a lot of precautions when I went to I went by myself. And I took a lot of precautions. I networked a lot before I went over to the United Arab Emirates. It was in the 90s when I went. It was before everyone was so aware of Arabia. It was before 9/11 that this fascination developed. And so I went and networked. I went to the Middle East Studies Association and so on and so forth. Flew over on Emirates Air, got there. The day I got there, I was meeting a woman who is actually a Fulbright scholar, although she's an Emirati. She's the first woman to become the head of a department at a university there. And I met her. She said, "Oh, you'll know me. I'll be in Abaya, and I'll probably be the only woman in the coffee shop." This was a hotel coffee shop. And sure enough, there she was. And she said, I had just finished flying. You know, those flights were long. I had to put down in London. She wanted to meet me that day. This is the hospitality that's there. She invited me into her home that evening and took me to the women-only dining room because I had separate dining rooms, and this is a very educated woman who will come here and teach at Georgetown. We went 4 generations of Arab women sitting around a kind of a cloth on the floor, having dinner together, my very first day there. And she made sure that I was okay for the time there, got to see the things that were important. She took me to the university. She had to teach 2 classes, the same class to the men and to the women, but she did teach the men. And unlike Saudi Arabia, where when the men have to teach behind a screen, or the women are behind a screen, she could teach. She had to wear a headscarf, but she could teach just as she was with her face exposed. Fascinating, though. The security of those campuses, because they don't want actually, that's the other interesting thing. It's very safe. There's an amazing amount of patrols in totalitarian countries that are not at war. So you don't feel at risk. I mean, every time you turn around, there's another police officer.
How long were you there?
I was there about 10 days. Short trip.
Which country did you go to?
United Arab Emirates. But in the 90s. Before, it's different now.
Would you go back?
Would I go back? For a vacation? Probably not. For writing, of course.
I thought the United Emirates was a group of countries.
It is a group of countries.
Qatar
It's
and-
seven. No, Qatar is
It's
not the
not
United
part of
Emirates,
it.
but that is an Arabian Gulf country, part of the Gulf Cooperation Council. The United Arab Emirates is 7 little emirates. One of them is Sharjah. One of them is Dubai, is an emirate. So there's actually not all of the names of which we are familiar with. Qatar is its own country, separate from the Emirates, as is Kuwait, as are all the sort of Arabian Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia, which is of course the dominant force, although Qatar is putting up a good fight. These are all the oil-rich countries. The ones that are that don't have oil are not really part of it. Oman is part of it, which has a strong
Bahrain.
what?
Bahrain.
Yeah. And Bahrain had a strong democracy movement back then, but which has now been crushed, obviously. A lot of them have the same problems. This war between different sects, where like in Syria with Bahrain, the ruling family, which is what they call themselves, not monarchs, but the ruling families is from a different sect than the bulk of the people in Bahrain. So there's a lot.
Most of the stories were so descriptive and beautiful and so touching. Then when I hit the chapter on Iggy, I felt my heart. And I wanted to know if you, because it was just so out there, out of context. Did you discover that by accident yourself, or did you plan all of this, or when you were doing your research, did you happen to discover Iggy's by accident?
Oh, it's fictional. Iggy's is actually
I
fiction.
thought it was I was laughing so hard. I thought this was a real thing.
Well, it could be. That's what we hope to capture with fiction, that it's real.
Well, if you
But
make that up, that is so creative.
I should
can't
make
believe
it.
That is
You
so
know,
smart.
to make. First of all, I put this, even though that story didn't fit in the book, I wanted to put in a humorous piece. And it is aimed at other writers in a way. But where I started to, sometimes as a writer you just want to flex your muscles. Can I do this? Can I do that? Let's see if I can write humor. And I would study shouts and murmurs to sort of find the kind of humor that would make me. And so I kind of just once I started that one, once I had the voice, I knew I had the story, and I just went at it and had a ball. And although I have read it in a couple places, writers tend to like it, and at least certainly at Spalding. But when I read it to a group of amateur writers, not so much. Although my own opinion is, I teach at a brief residency, and we have writers. Question? No? No. Okay. Sorry. That's okay. I'm glad you're here. We have students from all ages because it's a brief residency. All times of life, people decide to go back and write. Readers in their hearts can be writers. They may be writers. They may be writing in their minds. We have had graduates in fiction up to 80. And the person who graduated at 80 published several stories after she graduated. So it's fun. If any of you are interested in writing, I just wanted to encourage you to think about it, to think about the practice.
I like to ask authors what you read for pleasure.
For pleasure.
When you have time.
Right now, well, I read a lot of fiction, both for pleasure and for study. Right now, I am reading the Burgess Boys. I have. I also could, who are my favorites change. I like George Saunders. I don't know if any of you read George Saunders. He's pretty funny. Writes mostly stories. His recent collection was called 10th of December. So my favorites shift, and I read a lot of my colleagues. So, that I read them often in manuscript and critique. That's what we do for each other. I continue to read well-written mysteries. I like Elliot Patterson's Tibet series. I like Henning Mankell. So I read those. Those are, my dips into great pleasure. And And then there are certain writers I follow. I follow Michael Ondaatje. I follow my friend Sina Naslund. I follow Salman Rushdie, although I don't think his books set here have been anywhere near up to his others. So that's kind of what I do. And I read a lot for research for my books. So I end up reading a lot of nonfiction. Any other questions, or ready to call it a day?
That's great, Phil.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Don't forget these forms,
And fill out these forms and leave them for us, because I will get books to you. Please fill them out. Take the time. Books did not come in.
Oh, good.
Oh, let me wait and see. Hang out. That's probably a good idea. But I have to be checked out.
Would you like one of these?
Fill it out now. So I can.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you for coming.
I see you tonight.
Yeah, it's okay. Fill out your form. Leave it
I'm-
here. Class,
is that-
look at me. Leave it here.
Leave it here?
Yeah.
Look at me.
Oh, okay.
Gonna take some pictures.
I have a pen for it now. Can you do it now?
No. Hey, hold on. Oh, you can.
Stand still for 1 second. I'm gonna take
You
this.
can take some pictures. Give me a check. To Kirkwell.
I don't have a check. Okay. $16 in cash.
But I haven't got
That's
it.
very cute.
Okay.
That's Maureen put it down.
Okay.
Yep.
Here, we wanna get a picture.
It's going to take a little while before I can get through. But there is something.
Our piece?
Oh, I can make it go right across the street.
No, that's right.
Whichever should be. This one on this side of the street. I can go wherever you want, but.
Julie. Get in. Julie, get in.
Get over, Jimmy, get over here. Julie, get over here.
Can't see Jimmy. I like that idea.
Nothing changes. Thank you, sir.
Come on in, guys. Nothing would change with that, huh?
I'll just put it on in an envelope.
Need a pen?
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to see the two of you.
Walking home? Or you want to ride?
Thank you. Oh, yes, I have already an earlier one. Thank you, but I'll get you some.
No. You keep it for the chip.
What?
Keep it for the chip.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So what, you can check that to you or a couple of days? Julie?
Yeah. One more
I
time.
don't read books.
Somebody like that.
I don't read books.
I read the Ray Bad Courage. It's a classic comic. It's a classic comic.
I'm going to get a haircut. Let's see.
Did.
I don't think I need to do that anymore. I mean, it's already been 18 months. Now I'm 8.5 years And I met some of them.
They pointed out where your loft was. Yes. We'll go over and have a cold drink. Well, it looked like very good. Now you have to find Amy one, right?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. It's vacillating.
That's pretty stupid. I know.
Oh, I will.
Find one coming up.
We'll see you later. She wasn't able to come to the hospital. Yes. But she was on. Good night. Bye. Chick-fil-A, how are you?
Good.
Thank you. Did you reiterate? Okay. She wants to use it. Okay. All right.
Okay, I'll bring it tonight.
Good. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Good night. Yeah. No, I'm trying to. I have. Why?
The difference
I mean, I'll take one.
Only that one that they brought in, you have to ask Julie. Yeah, just
Because I need a special.
Really? Oh, they have any type of change? Really, I mean, yeah. Thank you. Good night. Oh. Good.
Yeah, directly to
Where do you reside?
Outside.
Oh, yeah, really?
But will you have it posted online?
it's a group thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll tell you all
Okay,
about it.
excellent, thank you.
Okay.
It'll be on its way tonight.
Thank you so much.
I guess to me, you covered all about
I'll see you tonight.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, my God.
All right, young lady, I'm gonna let you get going. Just like the rules, we got two angels on each shoulder.
I know it's you.
Well, of course, but initially,
I didn't have a clue.
yeah. All right, and next time, here, over the years,
Yes, we have seen each other.
Where are you now?
So, even though I haven't seen some people
Very nice.
here.
Donnie moved from your house for sale?
No, no. That's feeling. Not my property. This is actually from Alan. I do have a couple of copies.
Oh, and this is like real right. Not what I'm in my chart last week.
Okay.
I mean, I still had you in my head as our class.
Hey.
Well, I know I had Julie.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, that's so wonderful. And where do you live now? And do you also live in the Touchins? And how long have you lived in the Touchins?
A long time.
Really? And what is your name?
Harriet Friedman.
Where did you live? Or where, are you in the same house you've always been in?
Started in Redfield Village.
Oh, okay, okay.
I was there on Hilton. And I was like, alright, what do I do? Oh, it's not awful. So that's done. And he said,
Oh, okay, great. We felt like Did I not sign it to you? Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Oh, excellent. Okay. Excellent. And did you pay him? No. You should actually have a check for Hopewell. I sent that to him. So it should be paid for. I sent it to him because and if he wants to send it down, then check should go to He didn't buy it. Well, of course, you always send it to a venue where you're reading. Yeah, but if it's going to be sold, then it should be sold.
That's when they retired too.
I mean, I'm not giving you up, but I sent it to him. He's decided he doesn't need to keep it. I would like him to have it on display, but apparently he doesn't want to do that. So,
Right now, it's to stay where it is.
as it is,
Have peace and have quiet and like you said,
No, no.
5 years.
That's why
yeah, cash is fine. Well, it'll go to Hopewell. I'm already.
Let me get out of your way.
It is from me. I sent it to him. Actually, that's true. That copy I paid for already. I already did pay for it. Yeah, that should be my copy. That actually, the cash will be to me. You're right. On that one, it would be. Yeah. 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 Well, here, give me this and let me.
That's okay.
Let me just make sure. And I'm going to put your name in. Because when we go out, I'll sign it.
My children.
A lot of nickels.
I know, I call you Feely. I just saw Karen. Karen and I were just together.
you did.
Well, I only
And I do
have
And I saw hospital
Christine.
I think.
No, I'm a Riley. I kept my initials on. Riley. I married an attorney from Woodbridge 39 years ago, Francis Riley.
Right there.
Wonderful.
She's not graduating. You know Barry. Remember Barry?
Yes.
In the grade.